Hi, and welcome to our live stream virtual opening exhibition reception with our artist Lakshmi Muirhead and her exhibition, There Is Always a Before. This exhibition of these phenomenal large-scale paintings is 2 years of work?
About 1 year.
About 1 year of work. And we're just thrilled in the gallery for you to come and see. So check us out online at www.jrinehartgallery.com. And the show is on view between now and October 31st. So you have a good chunk of time to come and visit. So I would like to introduce Lakshmi Muirhead.
Hello.
Hello. Hi, Lakshmi.
Much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here and for putting together this amazing body of work.
Well, I'm grateful for the opportunity to share with you.
So let's just jump right into it.
Okay.
The show title, There's Always a Before, which is also the title of the piece behind you. Tell us a little bit about where that comes from.
So I think for me, the title actually refers to a number of different things that are happening with this group of work. I actually started making all of this work at the beginning of this year, so January 2020. And at the time, as is the case when I usually start a new series of pieces, I had a loose notion in my head of a few different things. In a really practical sense, I oftentimes start thinking about the construction of the pieces themselves, and I knew that I really wanted for making a number of pieces that were fairly large. And
you did that.
And that I really wanted to explore just like a minimal set of materials, specifically plaster, and I love plaster. I always want to work with plaster, but I was thinking a lot of plaster, graphite, maybe a little bit of acrylic, but I wanted to kind of limit my materials and then set myself the task of just letting that unfold and seeing what sort of came of it. So in a way, I knew going in there would be tons of layering. That's my practice. That's what I do. And the title, I think, references in part for me that practice of how every day when I come back into the studio, I sort of assess what has appeared from the layering I did the day before, the scraping of that kind of thing. So I think that notion of like there's always a before does acknowledge the previous layer. So there's the first layer, there's the 10th, there's the 30th, there's the reduction back to the 15th, or whatever is always happening, or the mark that scratches down, you know, to the wood or something.
Yeah.
So the title, I think, refers to that. And the other thing that really unfolded for me, so oftentimes I'm thinking about, oftentimes thinking about scale when I start. Maybe I'm thinking about if I want to be doing individual pieces or pairs or trios or, you know, just sort of the broadness of the series. But then I'm usually also always thinking about ideas that I want to explore. And I think my work is very much about the universal experience, but it's always hyper personal. So it's not that I'm the first person, let alone artist, to be thinking about, you know, love or fear or any of those types of things. But I think I have a lot of discipline around just letting myself have my private experience and seeing how that comes out in the work. So at the beginning of 2020, I was thinking about the materials I wanted to use. And I was thinking a lot about maternity and, you know, I just tend to spend a lot of time perseverating on sort of thoughts and ideas and turning them over in my head and defining them and trying to understand context. And so, especially in the notion of like lineage and my experience as a child of someone, my experience as a parent of children, and that was all there. Then COVID arrived, and George Floyd was murdered, and the feelings and thoughts that then came after that just got deeper and more raw, and there was so much more information that I was taking in, sometimes to a fault, but I couldn't exercise.
A lot of information.
There was just like so much sort of happening, and I was thinking about it all. And then I think a lot of the things that came out in some of the later work also really were very much about like, there's always a before. Like this notion of this present moment is always contingent for me on the past, and kind of exploring lots of those things.
I love that that connects not just to all the thoughts and feelings you're having surrounding your work and what's informing how you're creating the work, but then to the materiality of thinking just the history of any given painting has its own before and after, and has its own like reaching back into your mind of seeing what you did before and how it informs your present. So ultimately the final pieces are a fascinating history.
For me, they feel that way. They do feel like, you know, a catalog or you know, some representation of like this period of time. And the last thing I'll say sort of about the title is that the title itself comes from, you know, I'm trying to think about when it was. It was definitely later in the year, but maybe, you know, still before summer. I was watching a documentary with one of my kids, a Netflix documentary called Disclosure. Maybe people have seen it. It's about the history of trans representation in the media.
Yeah.
And we were watching it, and there is this is paraphrasing, and I have a terrible time remembering sort of names, but it was in this documentary. There's a reference to a documentary from I think the late 1950s about a drag performer named Flawless Sabrina. I think the documentary that's referenced might be called The Queen. Mm-hmm. These facts might all be wrong.
We'll add any edits into the notes below.
So, but the narrative, someone is saying about this person that whenever she was pressed, asked a question like, well, what was your name before? Like whenever she was sort of confronted with kind of like, you know, that sort of transphobic inquiry about wanting to push against this person that she was, her response was always, there was no before.
Oh.
And I noticed when I was watching the documentary with my kid, I think we both said in unison before they stated the response, and we said the response. Like we knew instinctively what her response would be.
Right.
There was no before.
Yeah.
This is it.
This is who she is.
And in the context of that documentary, it made perfect sense, and it was pretty moving. But what happens to me a lot is like those moments that are happening all the time will sort of stay with me, and they'll scratch and scratch and scratch. And I was scratched by it and kept thinking about how for me, there is always a before.
Well, if it's this I think it's to your credit, to your personality of so much of your history made you who you are today.
Well, and I just think, you know, it's a convergence of lots of things. I mean, a lot of it is just personality, but like, I do carry around with me a lot of nostalgia and a lot of looking back and a lot of, at times, you know, sort of regret or ambivalence or uncertainty, or I spend a lot of time there. Yeah. And so to hear her say so definitively, there was no before, I noticed that part of the scratching was like, I really envied that potential way of being, right. You know, of being like, this is it. And again, I'm like putting tons of things on that one moment that wasn't really what was there, but I think it's just it's sort of a good way to illustrate. There are a lot of things happening when I'm working.
Yeah.
There is the tactile, constructive sort of labor aspect, like the physical process that I'm completely compelled by. And then there's just the hours that I'm up here.
In your mind.
In my mind.
Thinking of history and
all the thoughts and all the
everything.
etymology and all the other things. And then oftentimes it's not till the end or to when I feel like something has resolved itself aesthetically that I'm able to kind of like get a little clarity about what I was working through.
Yeah. So you made a very conscious choice with this exhibition to keep it very minimal. It's very blacks and whites and grays with a hint of color that we'll talk about. What drew you to this minimal color palette for this body of work?
Well, I think for starters, I'm always very comfortable in the minimal. Mm-hmm. But I just think quite literally, sometimes I think again, this is universal, but so I'm not speaking like this is unique to me, but I am sometimes very overwhelmed by the entirety of life. And some moments feel harder than others. This year's felt like a hard moment. Mm-hmm. And when I go into my studio, like I have just to acknowledge like such luxury around that, to have space that I can work, to have space that's very comfortable, to have time to make work that's protected. You know, sometimes I think this was a year in which I just wanted it to be very, very refined and very, the exploration to be very particular. Like what could unfold for me if I just said, no, you just have plaster, you have wet plaster, you have dry plaster, you have it in 2 shades, you have lead in a number of different sort of sizes, mm-hmm. and then you just need labor and time and thought. So I think that the austerity of that is pretty comforting for me sometimes. Yeah. Else I'm pretty overwhelmed by too many choices.
Yeah, I like that you're opening yourself up by limiting yourself in that way.
It feels like that to me.
And I think a lot of the ideas that you've talked about, I mean, we'll get into this more later when we talk about some larger pieces, but you talk about nostalgia, your history, you talk about past, and all of that still ekes through, mm-hmm. even though it's very minimal. Mm-hmm. With that, we're going to take another look around the gallery, but first we're going to show a short video of Lakshmi's studio space and that talks a little bit more about her practice. If you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we will do a live Q&A at the end. So yeah, please put in your questions and we'll play that studio visit video now. After quietly and purposely work for over a decade, Lakshmi Muirhead was awarded the 2018 Cornish College of the Arts' prestigious Nettie Award for her mixed media paintings. With a background in education and literature, Muirhead imbues her work with identity, history, memory, and perception. Her seemingly works of art are deceptively complex in their concept and construction. Canvas or wood surface, she laboriously acrylic, oil, ink, paper, and graphite in multiple layers. This process achieves a distinctly rich, subtle, and shifting texture. Text and retext can work, in contradiction inherent in grasp to fill in the fine details of the past. Muirhead is consciously relied on a definite and final moment in her compositions, leaving only a hint of what was of her work. The intricacies of layering are loved by the mood and the interpretive tension in life between change and permanence. Affect or internalize our particular beliefs. All right, welcome back. So Lakshmi and I are here in front of one of her pieces from a Dynasty series. So can you tell us about this series?
Sure. Yeah. So it's 3 pieces, and this is a series that I started closer to the beginning of the year. And this, I know in my mind at the time that I was thinking a lot about maternity, and so there's a larger, sort of medium and smaller canvas, and oftentimes like don't have literal thoughts when I'm starting to make this, but I do think there's a way in which over the course of that process, I started to think of these pieces as sort of a representation of a part of my life that has been incredibly defining, and I'm sort of moving out of, which is a decade of life really for me that really felt like it was me and then these two other people that were always sort of like that enmeshment and our just constant functioning as a unit. And again, I don't think any of this was like really on the surface or literal when I sort of started, but in the working of the canvas and in the things that were starting to come out in my sort of incessant writing and layering and all the feelings that were there, I think it was very much kind of about that exploration and the exploration of transitioning into so much more, I think in parenting lingo we'd say autonomy for them.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that it sometimes feels to me is like a rupture, or something like birth in that sense of like an even more just kind of primal and painful and necessary separation.
And because, for your personal history and your personal stories are kind of the background for a lot of your work, I mean, this makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And being that these are the only pieces in the show with this sharp color, knowing that you are thinking through this concept of, we are growing up, your children are growing up, you are growing up and changing, and what does that mean for yourself?
Yeah.
And you talk a lot about your identity and pulling things from your identity, and how do you see this as just an extra layer there, or the next step, or what?
So, one thing especially about the mark making, I think that this series, maybe unlike some of the others that are really kind of about like limiting the material, there was a lot more that was like coming out in this at times. Like I was using more acrylic at times, and of course we're talking about nuance.
Yeah.
Especially now that I'm close to it, I'm sort of distracted by it because like I can see the different sort of like colors and layers, and there was like, I felt like this series there was a lot of catharsis. There would be days where I would just be writing and writing and writing, and it felt sort of like a process of grief sometimes. These color marks, this is actually a color that I've used before in my work, and it's one of the really a handful of colors that I sort of crave sometimes. And I haven't really thought much in the past about why. In chatting with Sharon Arnold, who wrote the beautiful essay for the catalog for this show, it was interesting to sort of realize there is something about it to me that I do think is representative of the primalness of blood.
Yeah.
And I don't know that we're talking about that felt as evident to me, but it does. It feels like a scratch or a scrape or an incision or all of those like sorts of things.
Which is how you're making a lot of your work anyway, by scratching into it, and building up and tearing down and building up. So it works kind of with the material you're using, but then has this extra oomph of meaning.
Much more almost like literal mark. The thing about the work that happens for me a lot as well is that I'll read something or hear something that's just there as I'm working. And one thing that it was really sort of moved by at some point in this process was I read a little, I don't know if it was in the New Yorker paper or something. I saw a Sylvia Plath poem that I then tore out and put in my studio, and I didn't memorize the poem, but I believe the title is All Appearance, but there's a part of the poem where she's kind of, I think it's sort of an observation, thoughts, ruminations about parenting, about being a mother.
Mm-hmm.
And she has a stanza that begins, is this love then? And she writes a little bit about, I think literally she's describing red thread flying out of a needle as she's making clothing. So she's sort of talking about the idea of like, are these things that I do, these sort of like mundane, domestic, maternal things that I do, is that love? Is this love? Is this how you show love? Is this how you perform love? Is this how you feel? I mean, that's what I was taking from it. And the last line is about the clothing that she's making. These will cover a dynasty. So that in part is where the title comes from. But I think as far as like what I was really thinking about, there's a way in which these three pieces to me sort of started to feel almost sculptural, in the sense of like a trio, a unit that inevitably and hopefully becomes independent from each other.
Yeah.
But the way in which, dynasty is one of those words. We'll talk shortly, I think, about the pair called legacy.
Mm-hmm.
Those are words I think about a lot. I thought about, this year, their definitions, but also the way that we use them culturally, to really, they like connote so much sort of weight or sort of specialness or power. And we use them casually, we use them literally, we use them in all those different ways, and kind of thinking about like, in this notion of maternity, and this notion of lineage, and this notion of history, and in that poem itself, like that universal truth of we are, however imperfectly, however problematically, however like beautifully, from somewhere, and then for those of us that parent in a literal way, or just in more of a philosophical way, we're passing these things along.
Yeah.
And, so that, those are the thoughts that went with the work.
Well, and I love that you're thinking of this through this idea of the maternal lineage, and which is so antithetical to how we talk about things historically. It's this very patriarchal society, but then seeing these large-scale, powerful, minimal, quiet, nostalgic pieces that are all about this maternity is really wonderful. And you use, come see the show, because you can see all of these layers when you see it. I'm sure it looks very just white on your screen, but there are just subtle colors. There's a lot of movement where you can see that you've dug back into the past of the piece, added more to the future, dug back, that's informed the final palette. And these are this series of three feel to me like the most plaster heavy pieces, both physically and literally they're quite substantial. We hear about like whitewashing your history. We hear this kind of rhetoric of covering up the history. Is that something that you've thought of through this? And I'm sorry, this was not a question I had intended. It just kind of came to mind. You're covering parts, but then you're pulling back parts.
I'm always thinking about that in a constructive way. That's absolutely curious to me.
Yeah.
But also just, yeah, quite literally, I think I'm oftentimes thinking about the fact that there's never there's never the whitest layer.
No.
You know, I mean, there's always something underneath, and it doesn't matter how much we cover, that all of those things inform the moment or the experience or the denial, whatever human thing we're sort of wrestling with. And I absolutely don't feel like that doesn't mean there can't be newness or there can't be
Right.
a novelty or there can't be redemption or any of those things. But yeah, it's all, I do think about that a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the details of these are absolutely stunning. And you talk a bit about your mark making being this form of inquiry. And we'll talk about this when we look at some of the really big pieces. But looking at all of, this would be a good place to look at all of these, all cursive, all of these lines, all of this text or what seems like text, kind of offset with this really white background makes me think of what you had said about nostalgia being part of your practice, where a few of the pieces in the show look like they could be chalkboards. They look like they could be these tools of education. Is that something that part of your practice, part of your work, or am I just left field?
No, I absolutely, I've always been curious about marks. Intentional or unintentional, but just in the world and moving through natural space, like I think I've always been distracted by all the different ways that we make marks to communicate, to commemorate. Sometimes in some of my pieces, you'll see like there are lots of sort of marks that I sort of I don't want to use the word compulsive because I don't know that that's truly the feeling of it. But lots of tallying, and there's something really satisfying, to make a shape or a line that's a particular kind of way. I think I'm thinking oftentimes not just about script and language, which I am, but also just when you're moving through natural space or like industrial space, all the marks that we make to show direction and to show, to map things and to connote the way that we move, and all of those, tattoos and scars and marks that are just on the body from time and experience, like all of that, I do think has always interested me a lot.
Fascinating. Well, let's take a look at some of my favorite pieces from the show. There's two gigantic pieces, the Legacy series, and then one piece I'm probably going to ask you more about called Fugue.
Okay.
So let's take a look at those. All right, so these pieces are the three large in the show. The two behind me are the Legacy series, and this is Fugue. And there's a device that you use in these works quite a bit, and of some of your other work that Sharon Arnold has written in the essay that is in the exhibition catalog, which you can find online, called Systemic Semantic, which is basically this idea of text that appear, markings that appear to be text, but there's nothing being said there. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
So for me, historically, I have oftentimes in previous series written like an English language, thoughts, observations, memories, never quoting anything. It's always sort of my own thoughts and ideas, but typically always obscured. But something has sort of changed for me in this past year, and especially in these series. I just started to kind of like be really, really interested in the mark making of cursive letters, but also in the flow of kind of just getting into a rhythm of just stringing together tons and tons and tons of letters that are completely nonsensical. And
being much more interested in the themselves and the shape themselves and the flow themselves of any sort of communicative function of language. And I think it's become interesting to me for a lot of reasons. I mean, for one thing, this pairing, this pair, Legacy 1 and Legacy 2, which is, oftentimes how I eventually name things. But I knew in my mind I wanted something that was a pairing, and I wanted something that felt substantial. So when my husband Josh helped me construct the pieces, and I kind of knew I wanted something weighty, and I wanted something that kind of felt like something you would, like the see out in the world. And there's something to me about this idea of like, especially with these like tablets, like culturally how those are used or they function to kind of like communicate something broadly and sometimes something very like important.
Yeah.
And weighty, heavy, the proclamation type thing. There was even a way in which, I started to do the plastering at the bottom after doing so much of plastering on the others. These were made later in the year. That just started to intrigue me because it started to read and present and feel, like sort of marbles and polished stone that you see in a lot of public space and in public works. In contemporary space, but like, I think the asemic semantic, as Sharon articulately, I think that really comes from moving into a time in my life when a lot of sort of ideas and notions that I sort of have are really being challenged or disrupted or really just starting to kind of erode. Again, I think that's universal. I think that's in part to do with age and circumstance. I'm not particular in that, but I think for me there's been a shift, and I've always thought about language. I could study and know a lot more than I do. I'm not particularly. I do, but even that, my mother is an English professor, and I feel like I'm always, half out the door as far as like, there's so much that I don't know. Like, let's say that. The older I get, I know very little. But I'm interested in words and language and etymology and definitions, and I think the older I get, I'm just more comfortable with my sort of chronic ambivalence about, even this experience we're having now. I'll look back on this and be like, I don't agree with myself in a particular way. I just, the opinions are always changing, and the ideas are always changing, and what I'm learning is always changing. But I think in these, it sort of very much became this idea of like presenting something that's supposed to be so big and demanding of attention, but really it's anybody's guess what this is conveying.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think I've been interested in that, and I feel like that's
so the other person next question I have is, how do you want people to experience what they see? Now that these are out in the world and on display, we've had a few people say, "Oh, look at this say," and they get a closer. They want to see something out, and somebody knows they're like, "Where's that?"
Oh, sure.
Yeah. What is it that you want people to see and experience when they're with these pieces?
You know what? The honest truth is that, I never think about the viewer when I'm making the work. I think I'm just completely embodied in my own experience.
Yeah.
I feel excited and delighted when work gets to hang. I feel grateful for the opportunity. I feel grateful for having beautiful big spaces like this, and that I work in, this is literally as tall as the ceiling height.
Let's talk about it.
So I mean, the ceiling height of my studio determined the size of this. And if the ceiling height were this big, I think I'd be inclined to sometimes make something even bigger. So to be able to like move the work in here and have it hang like this elicits a completely different feeling in me. And so I don't know that I ever think about the viewer at all when I'm making the work. I would love that if people came into the gallery to see that they did have some kind of, you know, some emotion, some experience that was what they had before they walked through the doors. And I'm always curious about what people think and feel, but I don't know that I mean, to me, there's something deeply satisfying if I make work that when it's finished and it's hung and I get to kind of like be away from it for a few days or a few weeks, and then I come and see it. It feels satisfying.
Yeah.
I guess I have to not be too concerned about whether or not that feeling is elicited for anyone else.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Well, great. Well, we will open it up for questions. Put your questions in the chat. We'll go tonight to the green sofa, and we'll answer them live. Let us know what questions you have. And feel free to contact me at judith@rinehart.com to visit the gallery, to come see the show. We're open we're open Thursday through Saturday, 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. Appointments aren't necessary, but it would be nice to do that another time. I'm happy to show you the show. Shall we answer questions?
Sounds great.
All right. Okay. All right, well, thank you guys still for joining us. I'm here with Lakshmi Muirhead again to answer questions. So please put them in the chat and we will kind of wrap up with answering whatever you want to know about the show. But first off, how do you feel and what's next for you?
Oh my gosh. I'm just starting a new body of work, thinking about some different ideas to explore. Yeah, just returning to a fall and remote learning in my household and some drawing classes myself and that type of thing.
Oh, exciting. Yeah. So you've been taking drawing classes at Gage for quite a while.
A few years, but I really enjoy it. Yeah.
Oh,
I'm grateful to be going back.
I just have to ask this question because it also just came to my mind. So much of your work, this large scale work, is very abstract and big, but you're drawing, you're doing mostly figurative work. How do you kind of reconcile those two parts of your practice?
They are entirely different, but you know, I never really studied drawing when I was younger, and with this time and opportunity as I've gotten older, I've been able to give it my attention. And I think the big difference for me, and the one that really compels me to draw when I can, it's just completely attention. It demands my attention. Like, I sort of can't think about anything else when there's the model and trying to render. I think a lot of the painting and the making of the bigger paintings is more ruminative, and my mind is sort of all over. And I really like the discipline of the attention that's sort of demanded of drawing. Yeah.
All right.
Matt Williams asks, what inspired the name And Dust?
I think that there's a piece in the show called And Dust. There's another one called To Ashes, and I think that those are just snippets from prayer and ashes to ashes and dust to dust, those types of sort of poetic allusion to those types of things. not any sort of literal reference, but more things I was probably thinking about when I was finishing those pieces.
And those pieces are mostly like the grayer, darker pieces,
Yeah.
which to me feel very much like chalkboards in a lot of way. Going back to what we were saying about nostalgia, they feel very nostalgic to me in that way.
Yeah.
So I think of like chalk dust
Yeah.
and
Yeah, absolutely.
what that means to ourselves and our history.
Yeah.
Lou Williams asks, do you ever have a final vision in mind for a piece from the very start, or does it evolve as you work on it?
It definitely evolves as I work. I think I have a starting idea or a notion, and then it sometimes sort of stays that course, but oftentimes I'm just actually very curious about, especially with the ones that are really mark heavy, like how every mark will lead to the next sort of moment. And so every, hour that I spend in the studio or day or mark to mark, it kind of will inform what sort of instinctively I'm gonna sort of do next. So I have a loose idea, but nothing, I don't know where it will end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kay Kimbrell asks, do you make the intention to have a series, or does it come from how you react to the piece you've started?
I think oftentimes I have an idea that I want to sort of work with a pair or possibly a trio. This body of work, I definitely felt like I had more of a cohesive notion of what I wanted it to kind of feel like in the end. So I did have an idea of like scale and sort of number of pieces, but oftentimes it just unfolds. It kind of gets to a place where I feel like it's all resolved itself and I feel very done. And that might not have been what I thought would happen when I started.
All right, one other question I have then is, we had talked about the scale. Do you want to go larger?
Sometimes I do. I mean, the height of some of these pieces, it was entirely dictated by the height of my studio.
Right.
So that limited me in that way. I don't know that I always want to work in, with sort of these bigger, but I don't doubt that given a little more space, I would make some bigger things.
And what about smaller?
I don't oftentimes, when I'm starting to make these pieces, I don't oftentimes feel about tiny, but I do feel when I'm drawing that I'm very interested in like, very small and intentional and spare, and
there's something a little more intimate when it's just
with the drawing. I really, really enjoy the tininess of a lot of those marks, but when I'm starting to make these, I tend to want to give myself to the labor of a bigger piece.
Yeah. Which makes sense, especially with the plaster.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again all for joining us this evening for Lakshmi Muirhead and her exhibition, There Is Always a Before. Once again, on view through October 31st at the Rinehart Gallery. So feel free to shoot me an email, give me a phone call. We'd love to have you visit. Anytime. We're open, once again, Thursday through Saturday, 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. And then, of course, always online, so you can check it out there. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And have a good evening.
Thank you, Judith.
Yeah, thank you.